Evening, everyone. We'll get started in just a few more seconds. All right, good evening and welcome to Casio's webinar series on equity in education. As a longstanding member and supporter through scholarships of both the Benjamin Banneker Association and TOTOS, Casio is proud to partner with them in these important discussions. The title for tonight's webinar is, Do Mathematical Practices Put Black Learners at Risk? We are honored to have Dr. Robert Berry presenting today on behalf of BBA. For the sake of webinar quality, we are keeping everyone muted and all videos turned off except for the presenter. If you have a question or comment, please type it in the chat panel and make sure to send it to everyone. And we will stop Dr. Berry if there's an important question that we see that needs to be answered. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on Casio Education's YouTube channel and BBA's website. Also, a certificate of attendance will be available upon request. My name is Amy Chow, and I am the National and Training Product Manager at Casio, and I will be one of the moderators today. I also have Dr. Karen Greenhouse, Casio's spokesperson and consultant, who will also be helping to monitor the chat panel and relay any questions asked to Dr. Berry. Before we begin the session, we would like to take some time to share some ways Casio is supporting education. Casio has created the Casio Cares program to support educators and parents and students and have extended this program through December 31st. This program offers free access to our emulator software through the end of December and has also extended our free online training through the end of October. It also offers many other items there, so please go to casioeducation.com/remote-learning to learn more. Additionally, our always free web-based dynamic math software, ClassPad.net, is extending free access to its add-on functionality of AP Statistics and Computer Algebra System through the end of the year. Casio has always provided high quality and affordable technology for everyone. Most recently, Casio released its newest graphing calculator, the FX9750G3, to continue to address the technology access gap and support students, parents, and teachers. To learn more about our Casio Cares program, calculators, and software, visit casioeducation.com. And now we have Kendall Brown from BBA to share their mission statement and introduce our presenter. Kendall?
Yes, good evening, everyone. And I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Benjamin Banneker Association. The Benjamin Banneker Association Incorporated is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to the mathematics education advocacy, establishing a presence for leadership and professional development to support teachers in leveling the playing field for mathematics learning of the highest quality for African American students. And you'll see the link to our website there. If you could go to the next slide, please. Our vision is that all children, particularly African-American children, have access to the highest quality mathematics education that empowers them to gain the self-confidence, enthusiasm, and endurance needed to succeed in mathematics and to transform themselves and their communities. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, my friend and colleague, Robert Q. Berry III. Robert Q. Berry III, PhD, is the Samuel Braley Gray Professor of Mathematics Education and the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia and the immediate past president of NCTM. Equity issues in mathematics education are central to Dr. Berry's research efforts within 4 related areas: understanding Black children's mathematical experiences, measuring standards-based mathematics teaching practices, unpacking equitable mathematics teaching and learning, and exploring interactions between technology and mathematics education. Dr. Berry co-edited the 2020 book, High School Mathematics Lessons to Explore, Understand, and Respond to Social Injustice, which focuses on teaching mathematics for social justice. He has published over 100 articles, book chapters, and proceedings, and has given over 200 presentations. His articles have appeared in the Journal for Research in Mathematics Education, the Journal of Teacher Education, Education Studies in Mathematics, and the American Educational Research Journal. Dr. Berry is a two-time recipient of NCTM's Linking Research and Practice Publication Award and received the University of Virginia's All-University Teaching Award in 2011. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Robert Berry.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Kendall. Let's see, I'm gonna share my screen real quickly. Is that it? All right. Well, I appreciate everyone being here, and but before we get started, I mean there are a few things I would like to acknowledge. So I would like to acknowledge the Monacan people as the traditional custodians of the land in and around Charlottesville, Virginia, the land in which I reside, and pay respects to their elders, past and present. My acknowledgement of the Monacan Nation reflects my commitment to a culture of inclusion and respect that begins with those who were here first and whose continued presence is important for our future. I would also like to acknowledge the work and the individual lives of the enslaved Black people who built and sustained the everyday life of the University of Virginia. Scholars estimate that at least 5,000 enslaved Black people worked on the grounds of the university, with many in residence, starting with the construction of the university's lawn in 1817 and lasting through the end of the Civil War in 1865. These acknowledgements are critical public interventions, a necessary step towards honoring the Monacan people and enslaved laborers towards enacting their more substantial project of decolonization and reconciliation. So let's see. I'm having trouble advancing my slide here. Let's see what's going on. But before I begin, I really want to kind of share with you how I approach this work and how I come at this work. I think it's important for me to provide some framing around that. And so with that being said, I just kind of want to, kind of read a statement to kind of frame our time together this evening. In order to be truthful and fair and honest, I will talk about myself so that you can assess my presence in this work. In my life as a learner and teacher of mathematics, and now as a researcher, I've had many challenging experiences. As a learner of school mathematics, I was marginalized and confronted with many barriers. Oftentimes, I felt my voice as a Black learner was not important and was in many cases silenced. As a mathematics teacher, one of my goals was to provide opportunities for my students to experience success with mathematics and to give them voice in their learning of mathematics. For me, the roles of researcher, learner, and teacher of mathematics are intertwined and complement one another. Further, they provide the impetus for me to provide a voice for Black learners in school mathematics. As a former middle school teacher of mathematics who taught in a predominantly Black context, I understood the importance of broadening my students' perceptions of themselves mathematically and providing a caring environment where their voices were heard. Through my conversations with my students, I discovered that many of my students and I overcame similar barriers, and they were marginalized just as I have been. These similar experiences helped me to begin to shape questions about characteristics and perceptions common to our experiences in school mathematics. I cannot discount the fact that my race, gender, social class, and political views impact me as a teacher and researcher. This work is not neutral, and it's political in the ways we bring our own epistemological perspectives to this work. I bring a critical race epistemological perspective into the framing of this work. I use my multiple identities as the interactional quality in the work I do, rather than minimizing and ignoring this influence. And although I cannot say I'm an expert on everything about educating Black children, there are some experiences that I have had that speak to what Black children need from educators. I have given a significant part of my career advocating, researching, learning from and with Black learners. I bring this level of expertise to this space. The fact that I am a Black man provides me some privilege to create a discourse with Black learners, teachers, and parents in ways to access our shared connections and collective experiences. My beliefs, emotions, passions, interests, and experiences may influence how I interpret voices and how I make sense of the world. Often, researchers are asked to deal with this through bracketing. Bracketing indicates that researchers identify potential conflict of interest and set these aside. I am choosing to be unapologetic in this presentation. My strong sense of self, my personal history, cultural history, and multiple identities have brought me to this point where I must be unapologetic in my work. So I want to provide that as a framing because I think it's important that you understand how I approach this work, and it's been a significant part of my experiences in approaching this work. And so, as I begin to think about and unpack this, I want to talk about Black learners, and I want to talk about the things that we think about relative to our practices, and do our practices put these learners at risk? I'm going to make some conjecture to say yes, some of the things we do and that we value as math educators do put students at risk, particularly Black learners at risk. And I just want to kind of raise our awareness around this and hopefully have a conversation around this as well. So we are going to break out into groups a little bit later, but I just want to set some norms as we kind of move forward. I mean, if you have privilege in this space, be aware how much you're talking, how you're talking. I want you to approach topics with humility. I mean, use mistakes as a learning opportunity, embrace discomfort. I want you to participate. No one knows everything, but together I think we know a lot. So when we think about these norms, just be mindful of yourself in this space. So I want to go back to a president's message I wrote earlier this year in February. And the title of this presentation is inspired by this president's message. And in this message, I talk about I was asked this question: how do we help teachers teach math to Black kids? And this was my response to this. So just kind of give you some context around that. I was at a dinner where I was receiving an award, a part of a group of people that were receiving an award for research that we have done. It was a research dinner, award for researchers around my university. And I represented my school, the School of Education and Human Development, as one of the awardees. And so within that, a presentation of, kind of not a big presentation, but much of the discussion about what kind of research you do and all of these things. So I tweeted about it. And so here's the tweet. I'll just read, I'll see if I can capture some of it. So here's the tweet I sent on January 30th, 2020. Yesterday, long tweet, yesterday someone at a dinner event stated, "You research math and Black learners. How do you help teachers teach math to Black kids?" My answer was too complicated to answer at a dinner table with people who may not be interested, but my spirit was unsettled. I replied, "I believe all people, including teachers, must be concerned about the social, political, and contextual histories of Black people and the ways these histories shape how we see the world and how the world sees us. We must be concerned about Black kids' thoughts, feelings, and well-being." She then said, "Well, what does that got to do with teaching Black kids math? I said nothing the rest of the dinner, and my spirit has been unsettled ever since. Ever since. What I wanted to say and do was not appropriate for the context, but later I decided that I was wrong and I should have gone all in. So I don't know, when you think about this, and I'm, as a Black person, I've had these experiences where I'm in this situation, and then later when I reflect on it, I the way I restrained myself, and I take this as an act of microaggression. Really, it is, and in a sense that I'm self-regulating in a way that I think others don't self-regulate. And I say the person who asked me this question wasn't really interested in my answer, I think, as I began to reflect on it. And so this idea of, me self-regulating, and I make the analogy about kids in school, particularly Black boys in schools, and the way that we expect them to self-regulate when they are injured in some way. And I took this as an act of a micro insult, in some way that's an injury. So as I began to unpack this and reflect on this, I want to state my positionality here. I believe Black children are inherently creative, talented, and brilliant in mathematics. I think we should find the brilliance in the daily occurrence, find the brilliance in their story. Many of you have heard me talk before. I say this quite frequently. When we know their stories, we know their motivation. And when we know their motivations, we know their stories. And so this idea of knowing, and not just in their stories, but knowing the authentic, full selves of these learners. When we capture that, I think we capture a lot of who they are and whose they are. I'm borrowing from my colleague, Danny Martin, with that statement. So to me, such a position is foundational when working with Black learners. It must be acknowledged in the ways that one interacts, talks about, embraces cultural knowledge, resources, Black learning, and that Black learners bring to schools and classrooms. We have to acknowledge the brilliance. We have to then think about the interactions that we have with these students, the way we talk about these students, not only to one another, but also to colleagues, and how we represent and how do we talk about them to them as well. I as an educator, I think we must be concerned about what it means to be inside the social, cultural, and political histories of Black people, and how these influence their perceptions of the world, their thoughts, their feelings, their identity, ways of being, and interpreting of information. I think we have to find ways to get inside and understand what that means and how that shapes how one navigates in this space and navigates in the world. And so how do we help teachers teach Black kids math? Many Black learners come to school and classrooms with context rooted in the culture and tradition of the Black experience. As educators, I believe it's part of our work to understand and know and understand the resources of Black learners and find ways to incorporate these into the mathematics teaching and the ways and learning for experiences for our students. So, and I've gotten feedback on this statement, but I can say I'm unapologetic when I say this. I believe Black learners are not melanated replicas of the dominant culture. Consequently, we must be nuanced in our practices. And these statements, sometimes I hear, I hear these statements sometimes. I don't think of my students in terms of race and ethnicity. I'm colorblind when it comes to my teaching. I think we have to really consider that statement as an act of racism. Colorblindness is a form of racism. And so we have to, because when to take on a colorblind positionality, that means you don't see a significant part of these students' identity. How do you acknowledge your students' ethnic and cultural and racial and linguistic identities? How do you incorporate these identities into your curriculum if you take on a colorblind persona? what are the consequences when you don't validate the students' racial and ethnic identities? If we don't incorporate this, and it is a form and can be interpreted as a form, at the very least, as a microaggression, and one could argue that it is a racist act to take on a colorblind persona. So too often policies and practices take on race and context neutral approaches that defaults to normalizing the mathematics experience of white learners. My point here is meant not to imply that all policies and practices are detrimental to Black learners. Instead, I think it's necessary for us to be thoughtful about the impact of these policies and practices that they have on Black learners. And so I just kind of want to take up one practice, and we're gonna investigate a couple, but I want to take up one practice. And one of the practices I want to take up is SMP number 3, and for the standards of mathematical practices: construct valuable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. This is a practice that I think is highly valued in mathematics teaching. And I'm not implying that we don't do this, and I hope that you don't take that I am making an argument to no longer engage in this practice. In fact, what I'm trying to raise is, let's be mindful about how we engage in this practice. And so I raise this one. So when Black learners construct arguments and critique the reasoning of those in authority and engage in these practices outside of mathematics classroom, this may put them at risk of negative consequences. So in the discourse practices that we engage in our classroom, constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reasoning of others is something that we want students to engage in. But how do we then contextualize it in a space as a practice that happens within this space? And then how do we help students understand the consequences of the potential consequences, I might argue, if they're engaged in this practice outside of the classroom? And what made me think about this particular practice is that I was in a school and I observed where this practice was overtly stated as something that the students were doing in the math classroom. And then they transitioned to another subject area, and there were 2 Black girls who was actually engaging in this practice of Bible arguments and critiquing the reasoning. In this case, critiquing the reasoning of a teacher. And within a span of 5 minutes, they were praised for the kind of discourse they were engaged in. And then 5 minutes later, using the same positionality and the same practice, they were then positioned as being in trouble. And in fact, they were positioned to be in trouble. So I raised this question with the teacher, and the question, what came about was, well, we're no longer in math. But that's what made me start thinking about some of the practices as it relate to particularly this, constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reason of others. So as math educators, we'll be mindful of the ways and the practices are framed within mathematics, and with the knowledge that learners may engage in these practices outside of mathematics. I think engaging in mathematical argumentation may involve the projection of voice. So think about this. It may involve the projection of voice. It may involve tone. It may involve positionality of bodies, proximity, and etc. The potential risk for Black learners engaging in argumentation is when their ways of engagement are not aligned with the perceived ways of participating in this type of discourse, thus creating a potential of negative consequences. So when you think about tone, voice, positionality, their bodies, and the way that Black kids are sometimes expressive with their bodies, and that may not align with the perceived perception of participating in discourse, yes, there may be some consequences that happens there. And this is one of the things I'm concerned about and can continue to be concerned about. So what I would like for us to do is we're going to put you in the breakout rooms. I just want you to unpack a little bit about what you've heard so far, particularly as it relate to that S&P. I'm going to bring up more S&Ps after the breakout, but I just want us to unpack this one and unpack some of the things that, and think about other potential practices that we do in mathematics that may put students at risk. So we're going to be together you're going to be in breakout rooms for about 7-ish minutes. So let's go ahead and, I'm going to say Amy or Karen, are we ready to go and break?
Yeah.
All right.
Everyone can turn their mics on when they're in the breakout room and talk to each other, FYI. All right, so I'm going to open the rooms now, and you're kind of already in a assigned room. Dr. Barry, you're on mute.
I'm sorry.
There you go.
Okay, so
you need to share your screen again, yeah.
I need to share my screen again. All right, so here we go. Is that it?
That's it.
All right. Well,
not everyone's back yet. Some people are still talking.
Oh, okay.
They're gonna get booted out in just a moment, I think.
Okay.
That's good though. That's a great sign.
All right.
All right. Looks like they are back.
They are back. All right. Well, people are coming back in. This is great. All right. So shall I go ahead and get started?
Sorry, I muted myself. Yes, go ahead and get started.
All right, cool. Well, welcome back. I hope that the breakouts were productive for you, and the intention was to kind of get us thinking and rolling and moving forward on some of these ideas. So what, back early in my career, I wrote a paper that was published that took a look at what I tried to do was take a look at kind of the NCTM process standards and try to figure out how does this overlap with, Black cultural styles and how the literature in that space intersects with mathematics. Now, here's the interesting thing. If I were to write that paper now, here we are nearly 18 years later. If I write that paper now, I would write that paper much, much more differently than I did then. But I'm glad I wrote that paper. One, because it helps me frame some things and get my thinking moving forward in this space. But also, I went back in preparation for this, I went back and read that. And so I want to talk about some overlaps as I saw from that, and then kind of my current thinking as it relates to that. So, NCTM has the 5 process standards, and I'm not going to lay out all 5 of them, but what I will do is just kind of touch bases with, with them. So problem solving standard, many of you may be familiar with the problem solving standards where, using context, apply and adapt a variety of problem-solving strategies, reflecting on the problem-solving status. And so for me, what I've tried to do is kind of raise questions about these. I have answers in some places, but not answers to all of them. And so in what way do we use problem-solving in a social context in which funds of knowledge are accessible strategies to solve problems? So how do we use students' funds of knowledge in this space as it relates to social context? And I pose these as questions to be provocative in a way to think about, social context may mean that I now need to know the contextual understanding in which students come from and live, and how do I access their knowledge base in that space so that they can use the strategies and make connections with that for their mathematical problem solving. So how does creativity, experimentation, improvisation show up in our work as it relates to problem solving? Again, just posing this question as a way of how, first of all, do we value these as strategies, and what do they look like? as it relates to problem solving. In the same way, when I think about so Laura Balcom, if you haven't read Lauren's, Lauren wrote a blog post shortly after my president's message, and she began to unpack some of the mathematical practices. And what I try to do is incorporate some of her work in this, and so I'll share these slides out, but so that you can have access to her blog. But she took SMP1, which makes sense of problems and persevere in solving them. And this is her reflection on this SMP. I want my students to grapple with problems of the world. So here's that contextual factor comes into play in mathematics class. And know that together we can persevere to do hard work to bring justice to those who have been oppressed. So again, contextualizing social context that overlap with kind of this SMP. That the problems that are worth solving are far more complex than parametric equations and deserve the time to be explored during the block of math class. And so she's looking at this intersection between the kind of the content that she's teaching and the social context as it plays out, and working through that. And I think these are kind of the thought processes I think we need to engage in as educators, to think about how do we provide access for our students as they begin to unpack these ideas. So the second SMP is reasoning improved. And so, NCTM reasoning improved suggests that students make and investigate conjecture, develop and evaluate arguments. So I talked about that a little bit earlier, select and use various types of reasoning methods of proofs. And so the question I pose here is, in what ways do we incorporate experimentation, expressive individualism, divergent thinking, and a holistic perspective to support reasoning improved? And I want to unpack these because I know experimentation, expressive individual, divergent thinking, holistic perspective may need to be unpacked in some ways. So when I think about expressive individualism, it refers to cultivating a distinctive personality. So this might mean how kids use their, when we think about, when I mentioned earlier, tone, body, expressiveness, I think of that as expressive individualism. But when we think about divergent thinking, it's free-flowing, it's non-linear. And so the questions I want to raise is, how do we incorporate play, again, experimentation, multiple solution paths? So multiple solutions, what kinds of tasks that might open that up to the kind of divergent thinking that's free-flowing, that's non-linear, where a kid may say, oh, I saw how you solved that. I did it this way. And the connection and the discourse that comes about through that. And then a holistic perspective focuses on the integration of concepts and ideas. So math content is not mutually exclusive from other ideas, and a holistic perspective provides a vision on how these ideas are connected. So the idea is that, when a student asks, so how is this making sense of the content? And sometimes we do content in very discrete ways. I wonder how we might be able to have this discussion of how content is integrated and connected so that students can see a larger picture of the underlying meaning of mathematics. So Lauren talks about this one in her blog as well. So look for and express regularity. This is SMP 8, irregularity and repeated reasoning. And so she says, for many people of color, we have specific insights into different ways that structures are used to continually oppress people because they are patterns. And so the idea of patterns, that regularity, that we have been looking at our entire lives. So this idea of regularity and patterns. And so how does that, so this is a contextual thing that I think we have to be mindful about when we think about, kind of this reasoning and the expressiveness that comes from that. Communication is one of the other process, the third process thing I want to raise here is, and this is really about all the things I've kind of discussed earlier around You know, students organize and consolidate their thinking, coherently communicate their mathematical ideas to others, evaluate the mathematical thinking and strategies of others. So you can see some of that from the SMP3, use the language of mathematics to express their mathematical ideas. And so, in what ways are we attuned to support person-to-person orientation? When I say person-to-person orientation, you know, we see students connected to students, students connected to teacher, and teachers connected to students. That orientation of connectiveness and communalism that plays out. How are we attuned to the social and affect emphasis of communication? And so, you know, the affect that comes with that. When I say affect, yeah, I'll borrow from, you know, from one of my colleagues. Sometimes students listen with a third ear. And sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it that matters. And that's the affect part that comes into play. So this is about building a community that students trust and believe that they are safe in this space. And the third question, how do we attune to nonverbal communication? Do we listen to students' bodies? And in my methods course, one of the things I do with my students is when I use videos, sometimes I don't turn on the volume. I want them to see the students' bodies and listen to the students' bodies, because I think their bodies speak to us in significant ways. And too often we just hear what they say, but sometimes I think we have to see what they say. And I think their bodies, particularly if they're using manipulatives, they're using some technology, their bodies speak a lot to us in many ways. And the reason why I do that in my methods course is for a couple of reasons. Sometimes you're interacting with students, but you see other students. You can hear what these students are saying, but you can see what other students are saying. And how do we be able to kind of use that? I mean, certainly we then have to have a conversation to make sure what we listen to in our sight is what we heard. But certainly, I mean, but I think too often we miss opportunities when we don't listen to students' bodies. So one of the things that my colleague Imani Godfrey brought up, and we had this conversation in Portland earlier this year about this here, and this idea of restating and revoicing. And what does restating and revoicing, you know, is it one of these things that, how is that interpreted by students? And so in what ways, if any, does restating what students say take away from their agency? When we restate, do students assume that the teacher is saying it in a better way? And so I bring this up as a kind of awareness raising. And so to have some assurances, I wonder if we develop a sense of belongingness, connections. And I think these are important, because if we engage in this practice of restating and revoicing, then if students feel safe in this space, they then know what the intentions are for restating and revoicing. If students don't have a sense of connectedness in this space and then stating revoicing, or you know, they may interpret that as this person is saying it differently from what I said, or restate it in a better way than I said because what I said was not good enough. And so I want us to be mindful in the way we use this practice. I'm not saying don't use this practice. In fact, I'm encouraging you to use this practice. It is what is the sense of belongingness and community that will allow us to use this practice so that students will be safe in this space. And so connections. And so, you know, the connection process standards recommend that students interconnect mathematical ideas to understanding and building on one another to produce a coherent whole. And so the question I want to raise is, how does interconnectedness and interdependentness among ideas, items, and experience show up in our curriculum and teaching? And this is important because, you know, how does this show up? You know, how, you know, so when we say interdependentness, it is that person to person orientation, and not only from among people, but also that content. How is that content connected in a way that helps us see the connection among ideas? And I think what happens sometimes when we think about curricula, sometimes it's broken down, but units are broken down into lessons, and we do lessons, but do we create the opportunity to see the connection among those ideas so that students can then make decisions about strategies and practices they will engage in as they begin to deepen their understanding around content and practices. So Lauren, she brings up this around S&P 7, look for, make use of structure. So she says, when I read S&P number 7, I hear that my students need to be taught how systems have been created, often to keep certain groups of people in a cycle of poverty, chaos, and despite their efforts to succeed. This attends to the global structure of the economy, education, government, and policy, because no matter how much grit you have, you cannot compete against others who have generational wealth, whether the wealth be financial or knowledge-based. And so this idea of connecting the S&Ps as a part of a contextualizing it, I think is helps us understand. And I, in a way that, I appreciate how she interrogates grit in a way, that I've read in multiple places that talked about grit in the way that she interrogates it as well. So, and the fifth S&P is the representation. And so representation is how we create and represent and organize and record our ideas and select and apply and translate among mathematical representation to solve problems. Those, and it's, the presentation of models and interpreting those things. So the question I want to raise here, in what ways do we create space for learners to use concrete imagery? When I say concrete, it's not just hands-on manipulative. It is, I think, our use of technologies as well. Use creativity, verb, and divergent thinking. And so when I think about verb, I'm borrowing from A. Wade Borkin's work. And I'm going to invite you to read Borkin's work. Borkin's is a psychologist from Howard University. But he talks about, verb is the propensity for energetic, intense, stylistic body language and expression. And so when we think about this verbistic behaviors or this presentation of verb, it is that, talking with your hands, the way one body speaks to us, the expression of that. Sometimes I in my methods course with my students, I like to sometimes talk about, have you ever seen a person moving to music, but there's no music playing? That could be some type of expression that could be interpreted as verbistic. It also could be, so the idea of, using their body to engage the work because they're just verbistic. So sometimes, bobbing your head while you're working on your problem, although there's music playing, I interpret that to be verbistic. But sometimes that's positioned as deficit. And I just want us to be mindful of how students' bodies and how they engage in these behaviors that might be a way of helping them engage in the work that they're engaging in. So I want to offer 5 things. And so how do we teach Black kids math? 5 things: believe in the brilliance of Black children, disrupt exceptionality, establish windows and mirrors, funds of knowledge, and be a liberator. And let me unpack these a little bit because I know I'm really short on time. If you believe in the brilliance of Black children, if you don't believe Black children can learn mathematics, then you don't belong in front of them. In fact, you don't belong I would argue you don't belong in a classroom full of white children either. I mean, it is the belief Black children are significantly impacted by their teachers' opinions about them. And this can be both powerful and dangerous. And I think it can be powerful if we could believe And that belief shows up in the way that we interact with students, the way, even if a teacher doesn't say it, students begin to interpret how their teacher feels about them. Too often, sometimes I hear students say, well, Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so don't like me. Well, then I ask, did they say they didn't like you? They don't have to say it. Look at them. I mean, it is that interpretation, how if you look through the child's eyes and how they see the world, particularly in the classrooms in which they're operating, I think that speaks in significant ways. I think we have to disrupt exceptionality. I mean, students receive messages through policies and practice only the exceptional Black learners can perform at the highest level. And unfortunately, these things are internalized. I think we have to disrupt that. And I think we must examine differential access to curriculum and to our teaching practices to disrupt exceptionality. I think we have to establish windows and mirrors. You know, windows is a story that reflects on our own culture, helps us build identity, and mirrors and windows are the resources that offers you a view into someone else's experience. I think that's important as we begin to think about this. Too often, I think Black kids have mirrors and very few, I mean, Black kids have windows and very few mirrors in their experience. So we have to ensure that the materials are in the shared contribution of Black people in the mathematics and broader society. I think this is where funds of knowledge comes into play. And funds of knowledge are collections of knowledge-based and cultural practices that are part of families' inner culture, work experience, and daily routine. It is the knowledge and expertise that students and their family members have because of their roles in their families, communities, and culture. And I think we have to, educators should be respectful and knowledgeable about Black history and culture while maintaining a high sense of humility and curiosity. And this is the idea, how do we access and students and communities and families funds of knowledge, and how do we then incorporate that into our teaching? I think we have to be liberators. You know, educators working for the liberation of students of color need a strong sense of purpose. Educators must develop the knowledge and skills as liberators, not overseers of the existing system. And too often, I think what happens is that, you know, the existing system operates from the perspective of overseers and not liberators. And I think we have to be mindful of how that plays out. I present these 5 things not as an exhaustive list, but as I mentioned earlier, if I had to write that paper again, what would that paper look like? And then these are things that help me kind of thinking about these things. So I come back to this. Black children are inherently creative, talented, and brilliant in mathematics. When we know their stories, we know their motivation. And when we know the motivation, we know their stories. But I also want to close out with this. I want to close out with this quote from Benjamin Banneker. And I find this quote to be timely because I am a faculty member at Mr. Jefferson's University, the University of Virginia. And this is a letter that Benjamin Banneker wrote to Thomas Jefferson on August 19, 1791. And so Mr. Banneker wrote, "Sir, I suppose that your knowledge of the situation of my brethren is too extensive to need a recital here. Neither shall I presume to prescribe methods by which they may be relieved, otherwise than by recommending you and all others to wean yourself from the narrow prejudice which you have imbibed with respect to them, and as Job proposed to his friends, put your souls in their souls' stead. Thus shall your hearts be enlarged with kindness and benevolence towards them, and thus shall you need neither the direction of myself or others in the manner which to perceive." So I want to close out with this. I think, you know, when we think about how do we teach Black kids math, I would say what Mr. Banneker said: put your soul in their souls. And I think that's how we teach Black kids math. So thank you so much. And I'll turn it back over to Karen or Amy. I'm not sure who I'm turning it over. And I think you're muted.
Amy, you're on mute.
Oh, there we go. I had everything muted just in case. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Thank you very much for that and for that closing slide, Dr. Berry. We thank you so much for your presentation, the time you put together for that. Thank you, Kendall and BBA, for your partnership in this endeavor, and thank you everyone for joining us and for sharing what your thoughts in those breakout rooms. That was actually a new experience for us. So as a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be on Casio Education's YouTube channel tomorrow. You could also find it on BBA's website as well. If you need a certificate of attendance, please respond to the follow-up email that will be sent out tomorrow with the webinar link. Also, be sure to join us next week as we continue this conversation on September 30th. And you'll find the link there on the screen. And if you have any questions, feel free to stay on and ask and chat. We'll be on for a little bit longer. Otherwise, see you guys next time. Thank you so much.
I'm willing to hang on and chat if people want to chat. So just let me.
Hello, Robert. It's Christina Lincoln Moore.
Hey, Christina, how are you?
I am so good. The part when you were talking about revoicing, oh my gosh, it blew my mind. I loved it. I'm gonna share that. It was, oh my God. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
You know, Robert, I kind of put in the chat, you know, when you talked about the whole idea of SMP 8 and 7, the looking at structure and repeated reasoning, and how Black people inherently notice these different patterns. And I thought about one in particular is, you know, every time there's been progress, there's been backlash, right? So you think about Reconstruction, and then there was a backlash to that. And then you have the Civil Rights Movement, and then you have the backlash to that, right? And so these are other kind of structures that we recognize and in, you know, our daily lives, right? That have some kind of repeated reasoning as well, right?
Dr. Berry, did you see the question from Pam in the chat? In what ways might being educated in general have consequences for Black children?
The
Exactly.
reason I asked that was I was thinking about what you were saying about constructing viable arguments. And in our breakout room, we were talking about vocabulary. And I was thinking about just, you know, even the vocabulary we use, there's certain vocabulary I can't use with my family members. Like I can't go to my grandma and speak to her like I speak in a classroom. So I'm just wondering, in general, I mean, not only math, but sometimes just being educated in general may have consequences in different settings. And how do we educate kids about that?
Right. Yeah, so this is interesting because what you raised is a question that I think many of us grapple with because, you know, I mean, like you, I have to explain to my mama every week what I do for a living in the sense that, you know, trying to understand, but also the idea of how do we, you know, so in my breakout group, we touch a little bit on code switching, but, you know, I think it's different from code switching in a sense that, you know, contextualizing, because school is framed in a certain way that I won't say in opposition of the Black experience, but it's not completely aligned. It's not even aligned to the Black experience. And so we have to operate in these multiple spaces. And then that is the kind of the challenge. And so one could argue, how do we create spaces for where Black kids can be their authentic selves? And when are their authentic selves? Oftentimes at home. at church or wherever, you know, in their community. That's their authentic self. The question now is, when they're in school, are they who they really are? I mean, and it raises questions about, to me.
Hi, Dr. Berry. This is Lisa Ash.
Hey, Lisa.
So it's interesting that you should say that. And when I think one of the things that we keep doing is asking how we should teach kids how to navigate within this system that wasn't designed for them, opposed to helping educators to understand that the kids that they're teaching.
Right.
And I think, so when I'm thinking about it, a lot of times I think we go to naturally, especially as a Black female, a parent of a Black boy, 2 Black boys, that I'm always teaching them how to navigate within this system. Right. Instead of working with educators and teaching them how to help the children that are in their classrooms.
Right.
And so I think that's kind of what I grapple with as an educator and as a parent.
Yeah, that is. I think many of us grapple with that, and one other thing I grapple with sometimes is because of where I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and where I grew up in Hampton, Virginia. So I grew up in a predominantly Black context, right? I wonder what my kids didn't experience. Didn't get, I mean, and wonder what that might mean.
Yeah.
Hey, Robert. Daryl Corey. How are you?
I'm doing all right. How are you? How's things on that side of the state?
The same. The same. The pandemic is, it hit us pretty hard when Tech and Rapper came back, but it's going down a little bit.
Okay.
Quick question: as teacher educators of color, right? What would you say our responsibility is to share our stories, particularly as Black men, right? To these teachers that we're preparing to go out and teach Black boys,
right?
And along the lines of what you and Pam were talking about. What are our responsibilities as Black men in the academy to be our authentic self in front of our white colleagues?
Right. So, Daryl, I'll say this. Where I am now and where I was before I was a full professor are two different. Where I am.
Bro.
So, but even then, even before I got to the space, I was explicit. My methods course, most of the time, I would be the only person of color, and I was the one that was the instructor of the course. And so, often what I did in that course was not only I taught what I need to do for math methods, but I also talked about from a parental perspective and what it means to be a Black father to Black boys. And I often would say to them, I am trusting you with my son. And so part of what we're doing here is that you may not be teaching my children, but you potentially could be teaching, hopefully in the future, way future, my grandchildren. It's just, I'm entrusting you with a community of kids, because interestingly, Charlottesville City, had a very large Black population. So many of our students do teach in Charlottesville City. So it is preparing for that. Although you have this historically large white university, within the city is you do have pockets of, in particular in elementary schools, large Black populations, and predominantly Black classrooms within those schools.
Thanks, man. Appreciate
it. Robert, kind of in response to what Daryl was saying, I can remember doing a professional development with some teachers at a school, and none of them were Black, and we were looking at the data and we disaggregated it, and what we found when we disaggregated it, right, for the Black students. And we were talking about what we could do to improve the outcomes for Black students, and a lot of deficit stuff came out, as it usually does. But then some fairly decent stuff came out as well. But then the question kind of was turned on me about, well, what were my experiences, right? Kind of similar to what Daryl was saying. But what I found is, even if I were to explain, my pathway, I think they already see me as somebody who's made it, and they don't know that I could have been just like the student that you have in your third or fourth period when I was a 7th grader or 8th grader, right? And it's how do they see that 8th grader, that little Black 8th grader sitting in their 5th period math class could end up being me one day, right? How
And this is why I really want to push on this whole notion of exceptionality, because I'm uncomfortable. Kendall, I've had similar experience, and when people push on me, like they push on me as the exception. Like, no, there should be a whole bunch of me's up in here, I mean, a whole bunch. And so oftentimes I'm posed these questions, well, how did you do it? I mean, like, really? And so not really in the sense that, how do we construct these spaces, so that more of our students can be successful and want to be a part of our community. One of the things that we're struggling with here that's making me think about this right now, Kendall, is I met with one of our Black students who came to me and talked about the math department at my university. And we have historically some weed out courses in different places. And they're not necessarily posed as weed out courses, but the students know, right? And this student came to me, 2nd year, black man. He said to me, since I was in 5th grade, all I knew I was going to be was an engineer. I get to Calc 3 and it destroyed that. To me, the trauma that he experienced, that course had on him, his identity, he did everything right to get to the right university, get in the right program, all these things. And then he experienced this course that disrupts something that he's seen himself becoming since he was 10 or 11 years old. And people don't see that. And people don't understand that. And so that is a conversation I had with my colleagues in my math department. And when I had that conversation, they didn't understand or see that. They don't see real people or real stories behind that. And it takes those kinds of stories to kind of say, yeah, this kid, since he was in the 5th grade, he was going to go to UVA, become an engineer, this, that, and the other. He got all of those ducks lined up, and he gets to your class, and look what you did to him. And so, and I think that happens, not only does it happen to Black kids, but it probably happens to a lot of kids as well. But when I think about this, the trauma that exceptionality have at trying to get into the right level course, trying to get into the right this and that and the other, and the trauma that brings about, really has some impact on many of our kids.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I think, Madge, you were probably waiting, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to follow up on something that was said a little while ago. Lisa mentioned it about what do we do? Do we always have to teach our kids to adjust, or do we need to make sure that the system is adjusting and being more flexible. And I think we have to do both of those. And I think there's a third thing too that we have to keep in mind, that sometimes we need to create the spaces ourselves that are going to honor and nurture our children and know that they are brilliant, and know that it's not just one, you know, like when you talk about the exceptionality that's going to get there, but that, you know, there's millions.
Right.
And why
Right.
not? And
Right.
so I think that's a responsibility that we have too, to make sure that we're creating the spaces that our children need as another option.
Yeah, I mean, that is, I mean, for me, this is why I think the program that we have here, Math Men in Mission, to support many of our Black boys here in the Charlottesville area around, you know, one, provide them the space to be who they can be. You know, it's funny because when I think about when I teach in the, you know, well, I haven't taught in a couple of years because of my work with NC10, but when I taught 7th grade math in that program, you know, I absolutely loved the way we engage each other in different ways than they were at school. And I was very explicit with them in saying to them, I know y'all can't talk like this at school. Y'all can't, you know, engage in each other like this at school. But, you know, here we just gonna be who we are, and this is how we get down. And there was a certain level of comfort that came with that while engaging in mathematics in significant ways.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Thank you for this.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Berry, for all this. But I think we're gonna wrap it up. So
All right.
thank you guys all for staying on. Thank you, Dr. Berry, for your presentation. And we will have this recording up tomorrow on our YouTube site. And we will also share this chat, the chat panel with everyone, as I think there were a lot of good resources in there that were shared. So thank you guys so much.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.